Thank you, Steve. Steve is, of the 75 graduate students I've directed in my career, one of the very best writers, which is most of my graduate students are wonderful as far as research is concerned. A few of them really also have a great gift of graceful writing, and Steve is one of those. I would be remiss if I did not thank the archives for this opportunity. I think most of you in Montgomery know what a fabulous resource this institution is. If you don't, visit archives in other places, and especially the public outreach of this archives to provide programming for ordinary people, featuring ordinary people, which is the great genius and wealth of this state, is its ordinary people, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute, because I want to talk about that today. There's an old Hebrew Yiddish curse blessing, and I've seen it translated out of Hebrew and Yiddish in different ways, but it's basically, may you live in hard times, difficult times, challenging times, but you get the message. If that is a blessing, then I have been really blessed by life. I think that if you are born into a certain age, that age shapes you in ways that are far beyond your own personality. So in a different age, I really don't think I would have been such a controversial person. If I had lived in Connecticut, I don't think I would have been such a controversial person. If I'd lived in California or New York, I think people would have thought I was hopelessly reactionary and conservative, and would have been appalled by not the radicalism of my ideas, but by the ultra-conservatism of my ideas. Or to put it another way, where we are and when we're born, to some degree, depends on how people react to us and how we react to the challenge of life. But I was born into a time, 1940, in Alabama, where race relations defined who I was, and my reading of the Bible led me astray from the culture in which I was born. Then in the 1960s, there were the culture wars. Then in the 1980s and 90s, there were a whole series of public policy issues which I became involved with simply because my moral sensibility was inconsistent with Alabama public policy. Tax reform, Constitution, education reform, football scandals, even Auburn University trustees from time to time. So my public life has not been without controversy, and the controversy has largely defined my life. When I told my wife I was going to speak to this audience, she said, "Wayne, most of those people already know you." She said, "You're going to have a lot of good friends there, and therefore don't tell them what you do, and don't tell them what you believe. Tell them who you are." So I totally changed what I was going to tell you, which was a policy wonk kind of thing. And instead, what I want to tell you is who I am. In that regard, I cannot separate who I am from controversy, and I cannot separate controversy from what I'm going to mainly tell you about. For instance, during the 1980s, I became involved in a fairly vigorous intramural fight with Bobby Lauder about the nature of Auburn University and the future of the university. Lauder, entirely logically, defined Auburn in terms of a land-grant tradition of professional schools, excuse me, and he didn't really see the use of history, philosophy, religion, and in fact even commented snidely at private trustee meetings, compare the salary of a historian or a philosopher or someone in the religion department to someone who goes into business. And of course, it was the 1980s and 90s, and as you know, an MBA was sort of the nirvana, the way in which you had a good life. And so we engaged in a rather vigorous debate, both internally at Auburn and also in the pages of the Chronicle for Higher Education and in various other ways. And depending on which side you were on, you got affirmation of your position. And I suppose he got hate mail, and I certainly got hate mail. Excuse me. But some of my fan mail will help you understand the nature of this controversy. For instance, I received a letter from someone who identified himself, quote, as a pissed-off reader in or around Atlanta and a dedicated Auburn fan. I don't know exactly what that means, but I have a hunch. And in the first paragraph, he wrote that I was an ass, an oaf, a dullard, a simple butt, a knave, an academic incubus, an incorrigible scapegrouse, a carousing scalawag, or maybe you're just a merely elitist, airheaded bastard. That torrent of opprobrium tumbled out of only the first line of 7 paragraphs. The second paragraph didn't really advance his argument very much, but did demonstrate that he was a master of invective. I quote again, "Attempts like yours to redefine what a university is are unspeakably ugly to me. Your incessant querulousness, indeed your booger-eating, bed-wetting, hand-wringing dirge cries for social justice really only peas on the fiery enthusiasm of our children seeking enlightenment." Well, that sort of gives you an idea of what it was like at Auburn during these years. Thank you, Debbie. Count on the staff to always save me, especially if it's one of my former graduate students and I can revoke her degree. Or take another one. I introduced a resolution at a faculty meeting after meetings with Terry Bowden about scandals in the Auburn Athletic Department involving Bobby Lauder and at least 3 trustees who were actually paying money to buy players. This is in the 1980s. And so knowing this, and the faculty did not know this, but I introduced a resolution to have the NCAA investigate the athletic program, sort of. Usually it's Alabama people who do that, not Auburn people. And so a lot of folks took a dim view of this. This is a letter from an Auburn University graduate in Coleman who identified himself as a multi-generational Auburn family with many members who had graduated from the school. "The Board of Trustees does suck, sir, but they don't approach you in terms of self-importance. You must be the biggest asshole on the Auburn campus. Your plea to the NCAA must be the highlight of your esteemed career. I would hope that you in the future would take your miserable little life and your miserable little existence and go crawl in a hole. I love Auburn University and agree changes need to be made, but your approach is so misguided that it borders on insanity. War Eagle." Well, that sort of defined my life, and whether it was my position on abortion, whether it was my position on education reform or tax reform or the Constitution, I have literally entire files full of mail like that. Despite years of increasing conflict at Auburn, I never became entirely unhappy at my workplace. The ratio of unhappiness to happiness certainly increased during my final 5 years, but there were always compensations. Students, like many of the people in this room, writing, outreach, lecturing around the world. Nor did I ever feel sorry for myself. Few people I know are entirely happy with their workplace. Even my father, the most loyal employee of a national corporation I ever knew, experienced incompetent, arrogant bosses who provoked him either to quit or to transfer, which is the reason I attended 12 schools between the ages of 6 and 14. Furthermore, my family remained my primary sanctuary in a strife-filled world. My wife made home a place of joy and delight. Our infrequent disagreements were mere commas in the progression of a nearly perfect marriage. Now, that's my side of the story. If you want hers, you'll have to read her memoir. I can't imagine what life would have been like without her. Our sons, now grown, have married brilliant, kind, strong-minded sisters. I know it's a Southern thing, but they did marry sisters from Morris, Alabama, coal mining family. And they have borne us 3 incredible grandchildren. Auburn First Baptist Church has functioned like an extension of my home. It was, after all, the place where the family of God gathered. For many contemporary Christians, church is merely another venue for conflict. Our congregation certainly contains opposing ideologies and contentious factions, but tries hard to be open, courteous, and kind. By and large, it succeeded in important ways: support, encouragement, nourishment, intimacy, honesty, inclusiveness, love. The people of this congregation became a kind of family to us. The family of God sometimes, in fact, is more loving than the family of blood. If work and family represented the first 2 places in my life, Ken's Barbecue constitutes the authentic 3rd place. Barbecue is a complex culinary art never mastered by Julia Child. Southerners would resent the French school of cuisine, even commenting on the art of slow cooking meat over a hickory fire. Yet Charles' essays on sauces and the way they enhance flavor is not irrelevant to who I am. Every Southerner worth his salt, and it takes a lot to make good barbecue, guards a treasured family sauce recipe as if it were part of the family jewels. My father made his own sauce and cooked up fine barbecue, the best I ever tasted. But whether it's pecan-encrusted sauce from the Gulf Coast or a white sauce-saturated barbecued chicken recipe from Decatur's Big Bob Gibson's Barbecue, which began in 1925 and incidentally has won numerous Memphis barbecue blue ribbons, especially for its chicken and white sauce, or Tuscaloosa's Dreamland Barbecue in Tuscaloosa, black-owned and serving nothing but ribs originally, redolent in a vinegar and tomato sauce with white bread. Whether the meat is chopped, sliced, accompanied by fries, coleslaw, dill pickles, or Brunswick stew, whatever it is and however it's served, it's barbecue, and it's just fine with us. Immigrants generally have not been welcome in Alabama unless they bring automobile plants with them. But the Greek owners of Irondale's Golden Rule Barbecue are welcome anytime, any place. Barbecue may seem like, well, just barbecue, but that's to the uninitiated. The marketing makes it as different as the sauces. Chuck's Barbecue in Opelika outfits its employees with T-shirts that proclaim the owner's evangelical religious faith. Jesus, the bread of life. Every employee has that T-shirt. Nearby in Auburn, a more secular T-shirt proclaims a different message at Mike and Ed's Barbecue on College Street. You can smell our butts for miles. Mobile's Brick Pit proclaims its meat to be the best damn smoked barbecue in the great state of Alabama. And Dreamland's more understated advertising proclaims ain't nothing like 'em anywhere. Appropriately for a democratic state with a rich populous heritage, Alabama avoids North Carolina's fierce intramural battles over sauces, whether they be tomato or mustard-based, as well as that state's continuing debate with Texas over whether God at the moment of creation ordained pork or beef to be his barbecue preference. Alabamians like it all, and we pity people who cannot be more tolerant and ecumenical in their cuisine. Above all, we appreciate the democratic origins of the plate. You cannot purchase barbecue at the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. The best you can hope for in such an effete venue is a cucumber, egg salad, or Tito sandwich, or perhaps a Caesar salad. Frankly, not very satisfying, though my wife likes it. Barbecue is the macho soul food of black and white mill and factory workers, long-distance truck drivers, cops, firemen, soldiers, sailors, and Marines. It's the South's regional dish, and an expatriate has as much trouble finding satisfying barbecue in San Francisco, Portland, or Seattle as finding grits, which I once asked for in a downtown Greasy Spoon in Seattle, only to elicit the startled reply of a confused 20-something waitress, "Wasn't grits a 1980s alternative rock band?" Wisdom is regional as well as barbecue. Every true Southerner has a favorite barbecue joint, though we are tolerant of other people's mistaken loyalties and may even choke down a barbecue sandwich at their favorite place just in order not to offend them. My favorite place is Ken's Barbecue on Highway 79 in the Pinson Valley. My mother, father, my Aunt Ina Haygood, Uncle Walt, Aunt Louise all ate there before me, so I'm actually a second-generation Ken's gourmet. Everything about Ken's appeals to me. It's not fancy. In fact, in its former incarnation, the building was a gas station. Despite the inevitable kitchen fire and the resultant renovation, the place does not attract customers for its ambiance. There are 10 tables and a long counter with stools, which furnish too few places for all the people trying to get in to eat. Ken Roberts and his wife opened the place in February 1970 in a location that was remote from large population centers. So his clientele consisted mainly of commuters and pickup trucks on their way from Aniana and Blount County to the mills of Birmingham. Originally, he sold only barbecue sandwiches and plates. Dad began selling Ken premium Swift pork butts when the restaurant opened. The owner believed the secret to good barbecue was fresh pork, so he never bought frozen meat. That meant my father had to make special deliveries to keep him in stock. My father liked to patronize his customers, so he and Mom, together with my aunts and uncles and extended family, would meet there for breakfast or lunch. Fast food restaurants offered cheaper fare, but my father loved the 2-inch high buttermilk biscuits and the fried ham that went with them. A single serving of Ken's ham, which is the best ham I have ever tasted in my life, is as big as a steak. Only a Jefferson County Sheriff deputy, a 15-year-old boy, or a University of Alabama offensive lineman can finish one of the legendary double portions of ham. Incidentally, the father of Andre Smith, the most famous University of Alabama offensive tackle of the past generation, worked there, which probably explains his 340-pound son. When Darty and I ate there with my mother before she died, I would order a single serving of ham, which the three of us shared, and then Mother took home enough ham to last her for a week, eating it every single morning. The grits, gravy, and Royal Cup coffee provided ample foundation for obesity, heart attack, or a caffeine high, but it also satisfied a working man's yearning for a fitting start to a physically demanding day. Lots of retirees came. Commuters from Blount County, truck drivers, sheriff's deputies, plumbers, electricians, all came for breakfast, along with 5 motorcycle riders who showed up only on Saturdays. No one knows where they come from or why only on Saturday, but the same 5 on motorcycles always come every Saturday. Many customers arrived decked out in Auburn or Alabama hats or shirts proclaiming their football loyalties. I would oftentimes drive all the way to Ken's to get barbecue when I had my graduate students over once a year for their annual student dinner, and I knew I was entering hostile country. The owners were Alabama fans, and so were most of the customers. Lunch brought in the barbecue crowd. This bunch was a wider mix of people, including lawyers, bankers, college students, professional people stopping by to eat side by side with blue-collar folks. Conversation centered on college football and politics, and religion was a topic no one dared touch. Ken's could also furnish for a sociological laboratory of Alabama. Denise Gilbert, Ken's daughter, to whom he sold the restaurant, was one of the first female CEOs of a small business in the Pinson area. And the restaurant's clientele, originally all white, suddenly began to change in the 1970s. Originally almost all Democratic, it is now heavily Republican. More and more blacks also began to come, first in family groups or work crews, then in mixed race groups. One day at breakfast in July of 2009, I counted 16 whites and 7 blacks. 4 couples in their 70s, one of them black, ate together that morning, holding hands before they began while the black man prayed a fervent blessing. The staff was as diverse as the clientele. Sylvia Ann Bolden, a black woman, and the one to whom I gave the book so she could share it with the boss of the place, retired after 25 years as a waitress, but returned because she missed her customers so much. Most whites, she told me, were courteous and kind, though beneath the civil veneer of others she sensed real hostility toward her. Ken's daughter, and the other owner treated her fairly. When white customers didn't, she would go into the restroom and pray that God would let her get through times with people like this. When Rick needed advice on racial matters, she always asked Ann. A white waitress, Wilma Cagle, worked at Ken's for 23 years, side by side with Sylvia, and they got to be closest friends. A wonderful transition in the race relations of the 1960s and 70s by the end of the 1990s. A white couple, Bobby and Liz Pierce, originally from Walker County coal mining families, cooked Ken's famous biscuits. They had raised a family in the Avondale textile mill community where Bobby had plied his trade as a cook for 30 years. He baked biscuits for Merita Bread Company. They moved to a house on a dirt road between Pinson and Morris after their children left home and supplemented their Social Security income by cooking 30 pans of biscuits, 930 biscuits each morning at Ken's, beginning after their retirement at 5 o'clock in the morning. Exhausted at the end of a shift, Liz would often come and sit with me, my wife, and mother, pretty much wiping out the distinction between who cooks the food and who eats the food. Liz had grown up poor, one of 13 children, to a coal mine family. She and Bobby attended Liberty Baptist Church, a small rural congregation, though Bobby stayed home and watched evangelist Joel Osteen on television. After getting to know her, I gave Liz a copy of Poor But Proud, signed it to her. The next time we came in for breakfast, she joined us for coffee at the end of her shift and said, "That was our lives you wrote about." When the Pierces retired because of advancing age and declining health, Rick and I both grieved because the biscuits were never quite as good as when the Pierces made them. Whenever I felt Auburn's ivory tower blocking my view of the real world from my windowless office in Haley Center, a visit to Ken's always set things right. It became one of my most important third places, where I met, observed, and talked with people entirely different from my students and colleagues at Auburn University. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg, I know you think I've insulted your intelligence thus far by telling you a barbecue story, and you're thinking, golly, has he misread the audience? Well, that's who I am. Sorry about that. But now, for those of you who are feed intellectuals, the next part's for you. This is for the opera lovers as opposed to those of you who love Hank Williams, not juniors, senior. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg's book, The Great Good Place, contends that living a rewarding life requires a person to occupy three places: your workplace, your home place, and a third place. In the third place, different people from all walks of life and social strata interact, forcing you to act differently, to live differently, to celebrate the unique identities of people quite unlike yourself. A third place proves particularly useful when the other two places offer a person little or no satisfaction. Dysfunctional families are universities. Contentious churches are jobs. Deprived people of essential nurturing. And my post-retirement life has contained a lot of third places, but the favorite one is Ken's. All people have ivory towers, places unique to them that obscure their vision of the larger world. Your tower may consist of traditions, prejudice, family, friends, job, schools, protocol, ritual, regimen. Whether people drive 18-wheelers, work as nurses, practice law, preach the gospel, or teach in a university, towers exist for all of them. Towers are pervasive because they are familiar, secure, safe, and comfortable. Of course, the stereotype for all towers is academe, universities, conveying a sense of disengagement, detachment from the world, the kind of elites that ignore ordinary people. Although the stereotypes, in my opinion, are exaggerated and unfair to academics in ways, there's, of course, some basis in psychology. Professors work in family with their teaching, writing, speaking, and endless meetings. Like everyone, they often hate parts of their work. If, for instance, more than a small like the mythology of all families, actual academic life breaks down. It's not as similar and same as you think. All faculty may teach, but they are the commonality of their lives pretty much in. Some are religious, some are secular, some are atheist, and so forth. Some Auburn faculty, for instance, are atheist about football, which is incomprehensible, but it actually happens. Some faculty members wink at the excesses because they love the football more than they love the integrity of the university. Others denounce sports altogether and refuse to buy tickets or even to attend games if I offer them a free ticket. In fact, one colleague told me that given what I knew about the abuses of the football program, I shouldn't attend games on March. I love the sermon, especially coming from her. For her, the term student-athlete is an oxymoron. Because I appreciate sport at its highest level as a great human achievement, sometimes accomplished by young men and women who are not going to make A's in my history classes or even show up in them, I decided that if you want to understand Alabama, you need to understand the games that are important to Alabama. They won't be in a calculus or a physics or an advanced history class, but I found that the few I had were wonderful people and wonderful students. Maybe self-selection in my class explained why my football players never made a D or F. But they were there, and they were nice kids, and I was really, really proud of them. Furthermore, if one loves a place and a people and a way of life, you finally have to stop apologizing for liking the things that are important to the people you love. For instance, I once attended a bullfight in Spain, not because I loved to see a bull killed, but because I wanted to understand Spanish culture. I listened to Hank Williams, too, and the Delmore Brothers and the Leuven Brothers instead of opera or atonal music. That's who I am as well. My wife and I have had a wonderful 50-year marriage, partly because when we married, we had an agreement. When we were driving in the car on a long trip, I would not listen to country music and she would not listen to opera. It limited our cultural opportunities, but it made for a great relationship. My point is, towers obscure visions in different but important ways. I might have wished from time to time that Auburn had been the University of Chicago, a top 20 world-class university with 38 Nobel Prize winners, tied with Cambridge for the most in the world, a university that had no football team. But then I would have had no contact with ordinary Alabama students, and above all else, my workplace was authentic to Southern culture, and that was fine with me. The fare at Ken's Barbecue was not just pork. It was also stories. And I used to take a notebook and write the stories down. It was a sort of genetic thing from my father's upbringing, I suppose. He used to have these wonderful stories and aphorisms that would make me laugh so hard that my sides would hurt. As I conducted research for this book, Keeping the Faith, the repertoire of historical research in music and folklore from my father and others filled the pages. Incidentally, I did many, many hours of oral history with my father, and the frontest cover of the book is actually one of those sessions where I'm recording his stories. From that session, this is what I look like now, and that's what I looked like when I was 6 years old. I'd been to 3 schools that year, and that was 3 of the 14 I went to between 6 or 12 that I went to between 6 and 14. And I was like a deer caught in the headlight because I wasn't even sure what state we lived in, much less where I was. And during those days, my father began telling stories using aphorisms, which I used to call dadisms. Here are a few of them. Buck Cherry, his best friend in Pinson, wild as a Texas jackrabbit. Other aphorisms, thrifty people, Dad described as tight as bark on a tree. Old Ray was tight. He'd skin a dang flea for his hide and tallow. Describing a female cousin who talked too much, Dad told me she could talk the horns off a billy goat. People he did not like were lower than suck-egg dogs. When they got their comeuppance, it broke them from sucking eggs. A good put-down inspired Dad to proclaim, I wouldn't slam a door in a man's face as hard as that. Speaking of the best syrup maker in Shady Glen, Alabama, he said, when old man Ben Lloyd made sorghum syrup, it was so clear you could read a newspaper through it. Or back in the Depression, Dad told me a quarter was big as a wagon wheel, just to give you an example of that. Well, those kind of stories were stories and aphorisms that I collected for generations. Rich as the South's folk music is, our storytelling exceeds it all. The stories I collected through the years contained laughter, regional seasoning of universal themes, and gender class-based put-downs. One storyteller who grew up in Kawaki Mills in Eufaula on the wrong side of the tracks, the woman was poor herself in white, but she had enough money to hire a black maid who was even poorer than she was, and they became sort of friends in the great turmoil of the Depression. The black woman cooked and cleaned, but actually she was sort of a psychologist for the white woman. The two women sort of bonded in their common misfortune, and when the white woman became clinically depressed over the declining status of the family during the Great Depression, the black cleaning woman became the person who boosted her. Her favorite line was, don't you get depressed, honey. You just as blue blood as anybody in Eufaula, Alabama. You hold your head up so high that your behind can't touch the ground. Another one of my favorite stories that I collected was a man who named his dog Jesus H. Christ. Now, you might think that he's just an eccentric and irreligious, but that's not the case. When he shouted for his dog from his front porch, neighbors thought he had joined the Pentecostals. And the profane good old boys, who constituted his closest friends, congratulated him on his bodacious profanity, which stopped just short of blasphemy. And his hunting buddies were delighted because they thought the name Jesus H. Christ served as a totem conferring magical power to their deer hunting. My father, on occasion, was known to drink more than he should and recognized there were certain dangers in the practice. While he owned my grandfather's store on Sweeney Hollow Road, Dad rented it to Bobby, a Thai immigrant who did not completely understand the language or Southern folkways. During my Uncle Kurt's carpentry repairs on the man's house, Bobby told him that some animal had taken up residence in his attic. Kurt investigated and found a family of squirrels in the attic. "How can I get rid of them?" Bobby asked him. "Can you shoot them for me?" Kurt, an excellent marksman but now with failing eyesight, declined, but asked his best drinking buddy, Ronnie Davis, to come and help out Bobby. Davis agreed to kill the squirrels for a six-pack of beer. On the appointed day, Ronnie showed up with his weapon in hand, but began drinking beer before he started shooting squirrels. After several fell victim to Davis's marksmanship, the others scattered across the attic, taking refuge behind trusses and shingles. Unfortunately, when Ronnie ran out of beer, Bobby, in a serious mistake of judgment, brought him another six-pack. That's now 12 cans of beers, and he's still shooting. By the time Davis had finished the beer and the shooting, Dad described Bobby's roof as looking like a piece of Swiss cheese. My Auburn University colleague, Jane Moore, who has one of the best collections of Alabama stories I ever heard, told me one about Jewel Bell, a friend from Dozier from her childhood who was a bit mentally slow. She lived in an older house in a poor neighborhood that was not completely enclosed underneath. One night, a skunk crawled under the house and sprayed an odoriferous scent sufficient to wake up Jewel Bell, who sat up in bed, took a deep breath, and commenced a pitiful wail. Her mother came running to comfort her, caught a whiff of the skunk, and quickly hustled Jewel Bell out of the bedroom. When she finally quieted her daughter and explained what had happened, a relieved Jewel Bell bellowed, "Thank the good Lord, when I woke up and smelled that smell, I thought I'd done burst open." Now, such stories can confine Southern culture in pretty provincial ways, even make it a butt of jokes. For instance, Sean Bertel, a Nepalese PhD from our department who was teaching at a university in his home country, won a Fulbright fellowship to return to Auburn to do postdoctoral work with me. After landing in Atlanta, he rented a car and began driving to Auburn. On the way, an Alabama state trooper pulled him over for speeding and asked to see his driver's license. Sham had neglected to acquire an international license but had his Nepalese document. So he showed it to the state trooper, hoping it would substitute for an American driver's license. "What is this?" the trooper inquired skeptically. "It's my driver's license from Nepal," Sham answered. The trooper very carefully inspected it, trying to read what was there, while Sham, an absolutely charming person and a wonderful conversationalist, expertly discussed the Auburn football team thus far in that fall season. Finally, the trooper returned the license, gave him a warning, and then asked, "Nepal, isn't that somewhere up near Sylacauga?" When Sham arrived in my office, he couldn't wait to tell me that story. And he told it as a put-down of a provincial Alabama state trooper whose limited knowledge of world geography couldn't even locate Nepal on the correct continent. But I attributed a different meaning to the story, concluding that a good-natured Alabama state trooper, not wanting to ticket an Auburn University graduate on his first day back in the United States from Nepal, was simply having fun at Sham's expense. Two visions of interpretation, but I think mine is more likely right than Sham's. In fact, distinguishing provincialism in a folk culture, Hank Williams, the Louvin brothers, or any of these stories, with grassroots shrewdness is one of the hardest things to do and one of the most fraught with error in terms of judging people. You can sometimes see provincialism and put it down when actually it's grassroots shrewdness. The best example I know of this contest between folk wisdom, provincialism, and formal education comes from my friend Helen Lewis, sociologist whose work on Appalachia was essential to one of my books, Dixie's Forgotten People. She summarized a series of letters to the editor that appeared in a paper in Blue Ridge, Georgia. The correspondence concerned Gorilla Haven, a 300-acre sanctuary for gorillas who were aging or had become incorrigible. They were in Fannin County, Georgia, an all-white mountain redoubt of 20,000 people a few miles from the North Carolina state line. Many of the residents were newcomers fleeing Florida hurricanes or northern Texas. Local Appalachian folk were not overjoyed by this influx of outsiders and particularly disliked the idea of the gorillas that one couple brought with them. Locals complained that the sanctuary lowered their property values, and besides that, an escapee from Gorilla Haven might even attack a local resident. Many newcomers thought these anxieties were absolutely silly and hopelessly backward and provincial. This provoked a local man to comment that he had rather have the gorillas than the Floridians. Another clever Appalachian wrote that the gorillas would be fine if they were indigenous gorillas, but they were outside gorillas. That letter inspired a retort from a man who had been in favor of the gorillas until he read that letter, but had changed his mind because of the indigenous animal argument. If all the animals not indigenous to the Appalachian Mountains could be banned or destroyed, then he could shoot his Florida neighbor's yapping Pomeranian dog that kept him awake every night. Well, this is just an example of the way in which Fannin County, Georgia, argues the question of traditional ways and life and the values. And I would suggest from the months-long exchange of letters that I would give all the advantage to the locals, not to the Northerners and Floridians who chose to locate there. If that suggests why I chose to remain in Alabama all my career, instead of going to some other state that offered me perhaps a better university job or more pay, it reflects why most of you have stayed here as well. Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and if y'all would like to get away from this fun stuff to some more substantive public policy issue, I'll be glad to go there reluctantly.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we will give you a microphone. Please speak into the microphone so that the people in the other auditorium can hear your question. First question?
Burtis?
I don't have a question. Actually, I think my voice is...
Just a moment.
I think my voice is loud enough to hear it. Not the other room. Well, again, I don't have a question for Dr. Flint. I actually have a comment to make, and I sat back here kind of mulling over the idea whether I should or should not. But as a former student, in fact, a present student of Dr. Flint, I thank you for everything that you've done to me, for me, and I do mean to me. Once, for example, it's the only story I'll share with you. I sent a document, a chapter of the dissertation of Dr. Flint, and I have a tendency to document just a little bit. And he wrote, Burtis, I could hear him saying, Burtis, you don't have to document well. Another time, he wrote, and this is something that I have kept in my possession, and I think I always will. Bold red letters. This is just ridiculous. Now, I try to be as frank with my students as Dr. Flint and others, including Dr. Harvey Jackson, so many others have been with me, but my ability to communicate with them in a manner, and also, I think, to encourage them to move on, I'll never be able to do it. I will forever thank you for that, Dr. Flint.
One of the things I try to do with the book is try to bring along a new generation of scholars. I'm enormously proud of all my 6,000 students, but Burtis especially. Burtis, if you don't know, is dean at Alabama State University. He has written an absolute stunning dissertation on Perry County, African American Reconstruction in Perry County, and the very complex relationships, which are not nearly as easily figured out in terms of whites and blacks. They come in all sizes and shapes in both races. And it's going to make an absolutely brilliant book about Reconstruction in a county in Alabama when it's published. I'm very proud of him.
Hey, Dr. Flynn, you think the Alabama Constitution will be around for another 100 years or so?
No. And I'll tell you why. The Alabama Constitution, if you look, I actually did something I don't think anyone else has done. I actually took periods, the first 70 years of the Alabama Constitution, and the frequency with which amendments were made to it. And it was one about every 3 years. And then the next 20 years, it was about 7 every year. And then from 1995, 2005, it was up to 12. Now we're amending it at the rate of about 20. And the reason is because the Constitution is so anti-modern that in order to operate a modern state without the state breaking down, you have to amend it constantly, and not just once or twice, but just 20, 30 times a year. The best example of this is the economic collapse of Jefferson County, the largest county in the state, because of the lack of home rule. The black delegation is the delegation is divided half and half, black and white, Democrat and Republican. The black delegation is never going to tolerate increased sewer fees because most of the people who pay that are going to be African Americans. So they're never going to tolerate that. The white community is never going to tolerate bankruptcy because they know the consequences of that in terms of bond and indebtedness, not just in Jefferson County, but statewide. You're going to pay another 0.5% or so interest on every bond issued in the state of Alabama because of the banking community in the United States is going to say, if the Alabama legislature is not going to protect the physical integrity of Jefferson County, then it's not going to protect the physical integrity of Montgomery or any other state, any other community in Alabama issuing bonds. And anywhere else in the United States, the local political leadership would solve the problem one way or another, and you wouldn't have this. But you can't because you don't have home rule. Whether, in fact, what's happening in Jefferson County is going to make it easier to pass home rule, or given the anger of the populace in Alabama is going to say, well, we told you. That's what you get. What you get is the Jefferson County Commission that created the problem if you have home rule. I'm not sure this is going to make it easier. It's going to make it harder to amend a Constitution. To expect the Alabama legislature to solve the problem is, of course, moronic. They've had 110 years. How long does it take a legislature to do something? In ours, quite a long time, obviously. So they're not going to solve it. The special interests are never going to tolerate a people's convention. So probably what we're going to have is a blue ribbon committee, and the one we have is as good as you're going to get. It's really, I was surprised, shocked, in fact, by some of the people on that committee. There are some really good folks. Paul DeMarco is a former student of mine who was in an Alabama history class. Republican from Vestavia Hills, a really neat guy, really concerned about the future of the state. The best possibility we have, realistically, not the one I would have preferred, which is a citizens' convention, but the best possibility we have is now. They're not going to deal with the tax problems, and as Mills Thornton can tell you, that's the root of our problem. And they're going to leave that off the table. But, I don't worry too much about that part of it because we're exporting now more than $10 billion per year of products to other countries, notably Canada, Mexico, Germany, and China, which are our four largest trading partners. Mercedes, Hyundais, Kias, products for Boeing planes, coal belt conveyors, precision tools. This is not the economy we live in now that created the political economy of Alabama in the late 19th century, where you were recruiting low-skill, low-wage people because that was the only kind of industry you could get. We were starving schools, especially for African Americans, because if an African American got a high school diploma, why would he want to pick cotton or mine coal? What he was going to do is head for West Virginia where he could still vote, or to Akron or Detroit to work in a mill, because he was going to be treated more decent. He was going to be treated decently, and his kids were going to be able to go to decent schools and have a better future. So we excreted our population, and the mentality of the state and its leaders was, why spend money on education because an educated person won't stay in Alabama to do the jobs of a low-wage, low-skilled state? Well, I've just described to you a suicide formula for the 21st century. We are stuck in leadership in that paradigm I just described, in a state where 54% of the kids in public schools are poor, in a state where in the year 2017, at the current rate of change, the majority of kids in the public school will be African American and Hispanic. That's 2017 when it'll shift. Or we are stuck in a paradigm where people who look like me have daughter-in-laws like mine, who began to have children in their 30s because they got graduate degrees. And in the population, under the age of 5 in the United States, 47% of the children are children of color. Under the age of 20 in the United States, 43% are children of color. And somewhere around about 2050, the majority of the population of the U.S. will be people of color. We can wish that we were back in the days of George Wallace or in the late 19th century, which gave us this paradigm. The truth of it is, if you wish that, you wish for national suicide. Whether this country survives in its economic competition with China, India, and other parts of the world in the 21st century. I'm not talking about way down the road. I'm talking about in the lifetime of my grandchildren. Whether we survive or not depends on whether we can convince ourselves that the quality of life and skill of children of color is the key to the future of this nation. And if we cannot convince ourselves that that is true, I would suggest you seriously consider moving to China or Canada, because you don't want to be in Alabama or the U.S. Just that simple, really. Not a moral issue. It's just an economic issue. And what will ultimately change the Constitution is the economic issue, not the moral issue.
Friends of mine would say, wait, why in the world are you leaving Kentucky to move to the swamps of Alabama? And I got tired of hearing it. And finally, my stock response would be to get close to my home cemetery. They didn't believe what I said, to get close to my home cemetery. I've been knowing since I was a little baby where I was going to be buried. You know, it's important. And they just didn't believe it. One of the first people I met when I got back home was near Inverness. Used to be a school there that I attended, country school. And I was driving with my friend Greg Swimmer one afternoon, and we went through Inverness to the Connecticut River. And I saw this black man, elderly obviously, fishing in the Connecticut River. And I slowed down and I thought, I don't think I recognize him. So I wanted to know who it was. So I stopped and we chatted for a while. And I said, you look familiar, but I don't believe I know your name. He said, it's because I've been living in Detroit most of my life. And I said, well, why in the world would you leave Detroit and come back to Alabama? And he turned back to his fishing pole and said, the fishing is better here. And he didn't mean that as a joke either. By the way, some of you have seen the play Connected People in Human Springs. And I remember after the first performance, I have 4 brothers. And every one of them responded to the way my father went. Mm-hmm. My late father was dressed. He wore a shirt and a pair of pants.
overall and look country. And I finally said to the director that my daddy never wore a pair of overalls after he married my mother. In fact, I think that was the main reason he married my mother. He did not like to pick cotton, shake peanuts, and do other things that overalls would be useful for. And so he started wearing pants. I wasn't here, but I heard that he started wearing pants and a shirt before my mother said yes. And then after she said yes, never again would he wear a pair of overalls.
For those of you who do not know Wade Hall, who wrote a brilliant book on Southern humor called The Smiling Phoenix, and a play on Conecuh River people, and I would. It's just a wonderful book because it talks about a sense of community. I have a story, something like that. I'm a creek fisherman. I like lake fish, but I love to creek fish, seine my own bait. And I was fishing Hatchet Creek in Clay County many years ago. And we had fished all day, my fishing buddy and I, and we had a long stringer of bass out of the river, and we were headed home to eat royally. And as we were walking down the road, we had walked up the river, we were coming back down the highway, and of course, we looked awful, as you can well imagine. So wading in a creek, in a hot Alabama day, and sweaty, and we'd been in the water up as far as our chest. And a wonderful, beautiful Chrysler stopped. He went by us, and then he backed up. An African-American man driving it, African-American woman sitting next to him, two teenage girls in the back. Now, I've never seen two teenage girls who expressed such utter contempt for where they were and what they were doing. And the man backed up, and he said, "Are you from around here?" And I said, "No, sir, we're not from here." She said, "You know this place?" And I said, "Yeah, my wife's people are from here. This is where their reunion always is, near Hatchet Creek Presbyterian Church." And he said, "Did you catch those fish in Hatchet Creek?" And I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "My people were from here, and I wanted to show my two daughters where they came from." And I brought them back. We were on the way from Disney World to Detroit, where he had worked in the automobile factories. And he said, "I detoured to show them where they came from." And he asked me, "Do you know where this certain such place?" I said, "No, but I can tell you who does. The Carmichael sisters. Go see them." I told them how to get there. These two teenage girls could not have been more not Hatchet Creek, not Alabama. They wanted nothing to do with this. This man, approaching the end of his life, was so anxious to reconnect to his sense of community. In the 1980s, for the first time, more African Americans moved to Alabama than left Alabama. And the migration now is so dramatic that we're going to be upwards of 1/3 African American in the state within a period of about 15 years, because an awful lot of people are reconnecting with that community. One more question? Or is this the end? This is the end, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
And Dr. Flynt will be here after the program. You're welcome to talk with him after the program or have him sign your book. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Dr. Flynt.
Do you have books?
They'll bring their books. The books are for sale. They'll bring them right up here. Books are for sale in the lobby.
Good to see you again. How's the archives?
Wonderful.
Good.
Overwhelmed.
Good.
Overwhelmed. I wanted to ask you, what did you think of when you said just be simple when you talk about the Constitution?